Okay, good morning, everyone. Today is Friday, November 20th. This is our 10 a.m. session for Stream 4 here at CrimCon. I'd like to welcome everybody to this panel on courts. We have three presenters today. We're going to go in order of the program. So our first presenter will be Michelle Bolger. Our second presenter will be Kate Burmon. And our third presenter will be Sophia Sarantakos.
Sarantakos, yeah.
Sarantakos. Okay, perfect. So for those of you who have joined us as attendees, please feel free during the presentation to drop any questions in the Q&A, and we will come back to the questions at the end of the session. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Michelle.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I just want to say thanks for joining us, and thank you to all of those who helped organize this event and participated in it. It's so nice to see people and be able to share even in this weird environment. So today I'm presenting a very different paper for me personally. It's kind of special. It's a paper that I collaborated with my master's student on. He is a probation officer with our Bucks County here in Eastern Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, he couldn't get off work, so he's not able to join us. But this paper, the data from it actually comes from his dissertation, or I guess we don't really call it a dissertation, like his master's thesis capstone project from Bucks County. So we kind of worked on turning it into a paper, and we just got an R&R from Corrections Policy, Practice, and Research. So we'll be working on that and hopefully have the full manuscript out at some point. The paper, of course, is on pretrial release programming. You know, pretrial is such a critical point in the process. I think that it represents obviously an important part for jail overcrowding issues. You know, over 60% are there for pretrial. So we know that pretrial release programs are very important for the system. But a lot of research has also shown that relative to those who can't make bail and are detained, people with pretrial release and similar outcomes tend to have better dispositions. They're less likely to get harsher sentencing. So there's a lot of benefits for the offenders as well, getting connected to programming and things like that. Oddly enough, despite the fact that we all recognize, I think professionally, that pretrial is pretty important, these programs, there's actually not a lot of quantitative research on SPR outcomes. And I think part of it, from what I've discovered working with my student, is that just the data collection effort is not there. While a lot of our probation and parole departments are starting to implement our effective-based practices using the risk assessments, ethics training, things like that, they've just not entirely gotten to the point where they've been collecting data for several years for us to really have a rich pool of complete data. So this was a unique opportunity because he was able to get data for 3 years looking at recidivism 36 months out of or after pretrial. And there's only one quantitative study we actually found that looked at SPR outcomes after pretrial. There's a solid amount on looking at comparing folks who are on bail or released on their own recognizance and their failure to appear in court. But there's not a lot looking at after pretrial. So there was only one study we found that looked at that, and it was different outcomes. They were looking at employment and social security status and things like that. It was a little outside of our discipline. So we wanted to give this a shot and see what we could find. So our current study, we had two goals: examine the proportion of offenders who did successfully complete the pretrial release program, and then the relevant predictors of successful completion. And then more interestingly, we were looking at the impacts of successful pretrial release 3 years or 36 months after pretrial. And our main analyses were just simply in SPSS 2 binary logistic regressions. The sample from Bucks County, it is a relatively small sample. There were around 500 or so. This program started in 2014, 2013. But we wanted to have, or at least Mike at the time when he was working on his thesis, he wanted to be able to have 3 years of data to look at. So he selected only the adults who were in the program between 2014 and 2016. So they had to have completed their pretrial release by November of 2016 because he was starting the process, collecting the data in November of 2019. So that's the reason for that time frame. That yielded 286 adults. We had largely male, not surprisingly, 70-30 split. Average age was 31, but they did have a wide range. The county itself and the sample here is predominantly white, 86%, just about 12% African American, and then Pacific Islander. They did have about 4% of people who identified as Hispanic. They lumped that in with white. We did have a variable, just a Hispanic, non-Hispanic ethnicity variable that we did include at one point. It didn't really do anything regarding the analysis. So we ended up just excluding it and having race simply be a white, non-white. Most of the folks were not employed. About 64% had a GED. 18% had more than a high school diploma, which was a little higher than average. As you would expect, solid chunk, 70% drug abuse in this area. Heroin, opiates, and methamphetamine are big. And then some had alcohol issues as well. Vast majority had prior criminal history, and a relatively even split, 54% or so were misdemeanors versus felony. The program was originally designed for low to medium risk offenders. In terms of their dispositions, just so you have a reference, most of them were on probation, a tiny percent were on other intermediate sanctions like drug courts, and then about 20% or so were incarcerated. Simply our dependent measures, we had failure to complete supervised pretrial release. Most of these were because they failed to appear in court. Some did incur another arrest or some violation during their probationary period, but the vast majority failed to appear. And then the other outcome was recidivism. We used arrest. While about 69% were probation, if we did technical and direct violation, direct were largely arrest anyway, only about 20% had technical violations. And we were then excluding people who didn't have probation as an outcome. So we used arrest to be more inclusive. So arrest within 36 months after pretrial. And these were our independent variables. So we had 9 included in the first analysis, and then the second one looking at recidivism, we did include whether or not they successfully completed supervised pretrial release. What we found, fortunately, most people did successfully complete SPR, almost 70%, and about 57% were not arrested within 36 months, so that was favorable. When it came to predicting supervised pretrial release, largely consistent with previous research, education. Having higher education meant you were more likely to successfully complete. And then criminal history by far was the predominant predictor here. Those who had a prior criminal history were almost 3 times as likely to fail. Employment and some of the other variables did not reach statistical significance. Again, it's a small sample, and we didn't have loads of racial variation. Okay. And then predicting arrest within 36 months, 3 of these variables were significant. Age was statistically significant, older individuals being less likely to have been arrested, but it was a very weak predictor. You're looking at 5% difference there. The education one was very strange, and we spent a lot of time trying to figure this one out. So oddly, more educated individuals were actually 73% more likely to be arrested, which is contradictory with our expectations with previous research and even with our first model predicting success in the SPR program. So we did a bunch of digging, and after a couple of bivariate analyses, we saw that the a crosstab simply of education and arrest revealed that weirdly there was like 53% of those who had a above a high school diploma. The split was 53, 47. So more of that category had just been arrested. And so it just seems like an anomaly. I'm still trying to figure that one out. And then I looked at, there was no other main patterns regarding misdemeanor, felony, or disposition. So it seemed just sort of an odd finding. But as expected, those who failed to complete the supervised pretrial were 2.5 times more likely to be arrested. So we certainly see here that pretrial had relevance in terms of predicting that. And in terms of some of our surprising things, again, the education variable flipping, I was surprised criminal history wasn't predictive in the second model, but perhaps the failure to do supervised pretrial might have been a stronger outcome. And in terms of limitations, obviously the sample size, another thing, we did not have a comparison group, which is a big limitation. The issue was this department just wasn't collecting data at the time on folks who were bailed, ROR'd, or other dispositions. They started doing it in like 2019. Small sample size, of course, too, limited generalizability, but we were, we also had issues regarding risk assessments. We had about 100 of the sample had an LSIR, and then they were switching at the time to the ORAS CST. So we had some issues regarding that comparison, and our sample size would have been minuscule if we included that. But I did run crosstabs, and we did see that risk score did kind of correlate with success outcomes regarding recidivism and SPR, but we couldn't unfortunately include it in that model. Okay. In conclusion, I think that this is obviously there's methodological limitations, not having the comparison group. Not all the variables are perfectly measured, but I think it did suggest that SPR is important above and beyond the failure to appear outcome, which has usually been the main focus, and whether that's because of the connections they're made in the community during the supervised pretrial, maybe they're getting help earlier, and that's part of it. Perhaps it's more favorable dispositions in terms of their sanction. Whatever it might be, it does seem, at least in our sample, that the supervised pretrial release did help with recidivism. And it's certainly something worth funding. It's certainly something worth investigating further. And the other really important thing that I learned, as well as my co-author, was it's hard to find methodologically rigorous research because it's just not being collected or had not been. And so we call for a greater collaboration between practitioners and researchers, and more resources and funding perhaps for some of these departments to start collecting this data. We can't really produce methodologically rigorous studies without complete high quality data. So those are our findings in a nutshell. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Our next presenter is Kate Burmon, and Kate, will turn it over to you. Kate, just as
Sorry,
a heads
I'm trying
up,
to, it's putting to full screen. Yeah, no, I'm unmuted now, right?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, it's the screen is blocking all of my notes. So can't see anyone now. Are you guys still there?
We're still here.
Sorry. I knew it. I knew there was always going to be something. Let's see if is there a certain setting that is forcing it to be the entire screen? Because I can't see any of my notes.
That's typical unless you're in presenter view.
No, I mean, I have a separate document. It's not letting me.
Because you're sharing your screen. So if you're putting your PowerPoint on full screen, which is normally when you go into presenter mode, then that's why it's probably taking off the rest of your screen.
All right, so we're gonna do this a little bit differently then, because I've never had this trouble with students before, so I don't know why it's doing it now, but apologies, everyone. All right. So we'll do it this way. All right, y'all can do that, right? Okay.
Yes, we can see that.
Okay. Hi, my name is Kate Melody Burmon, and my research specialty actually focuses on cultural property crime. Specifically, I typically focus on fine art theft, archaeological looting, and antiquities trafficking. However, I also hold a position as an assistant professor at a small teaching college, so the subjects on which I teach frequently have no intersection with my research. But a couple of years ago, I first started teaching hate crimes, and that's the kernel from which this presentation grew. So it draws on similarities faced regarding the difficulties of prosecuting both of these types of cases in criminal court and how a civil approach may help, as evidenced by some successes already seen for hate crimes. Just to make sure I'm clear from the beginning, since I have no idea who is in the audience today, by civil law, I'm referring to rather than the civil legal tradition common to Europe and several other regions of the world. Please note, I am also not a lawyer. This presentation is theoretical as of now and is suggesting a means of thinking more broadly about pursuing prosecution in cases involving illicit antiquities rather than an approach guaranteed to work in such context. Prosecuting hate crimes in criminal court proves notoriously difficult in the United States. As such, few cases come before the courts, as seen in this graph. There are a number of reasons why such difficulty exists in prosecuting in criminal court, including the standard of proof requiring evidentiary proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Establishing true motivation to this degree proves an almost insurmountable task, given how easy it is for the defense to plant a seed of doubt. To complicate things further, police officers frequently lack the necessary training to help build successful cases. Some prosecutors believe a conviction is more pursuing the sentencing enhancement, so decide to take that route. And on top of all this, laws regarding hate crimes are just confusing. Compounding all of these issues, if a hate group incites an individual to commit a hate crime, it's almost impossible to prosecute that group in criminal court. Corpus delicti, or the body of a crime, includes in part actus reus, mens rea, and concurrence. So one must perform the action, have the intent, and these two things have to happen together. The hate group websites indicate plenty of intent to harm certain groups, and hate speech rhetoric can certainly incite violence. The hate groups themselves, though, claim no responsibility for those actions. They argue that there was no directive to that group member to commit such an action, and they certainly are not responsible for anyone who merely read their literature and propaganda but is not an official member. However, there have been several successful civil cases dated from the past several decades, as listed on hate groups, and received awards in the millions. Most recently, the case to watch is Signs vs. Kessler, a case filed against the organizers of the Unite to the Right rally that occurred in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017, though the trial has recently been delayed until April of next year. There have been two primary categories of success in using civil action to target hate groups: symbolism and monetary impact. For victims of hate crimes, or anyone else really, it can be disheartening, enraging, and painful to witness the disconnect between the levels of hate we are seeing in the media and our lives every day, and comparing them to the statistics of hate crimes reported, let alone prosecuted. However, this is where the symbolism of successful civil suits can step in more immediately, where the changes to our system will take longer to implement. In more states, victims can bring civil suit, and these successful suits send a message. They indicate that citizens do not condone hate. They illustrate the disinterest in what hate demonstrates to communities. Our criminal courts have not found a consistent way to reflect the intolerance of hate does not mean that there is no penalty for these groups. The emotional satisfaction and symbolism of these cases truly drives from the other benefit of using civil action, which is monetary loss. This is where the hate groups suffer, with numerous cases awarding millions upon millions to victims. Various hate groups have found their coffers depleted, significantly impacting their ability to continue their activities. It is these two outcomes that could prove equally effective in combating antiquities trafficking. Seeking justice in cultural property cases faces similar issues to hate crimes. Breaking down Brody's definition of antiquities trafficking here and putting it in the context of this talk, He states an illicitly traded archaeological artifact, illicit antiquity, is one that has at some time been traded in contravention of national or international legal regulations. Typically, it will have been removed illegally from an archaeological site or monument and or this is also known as archaeological looting, and looted antiquities derived from unexcavated sites. So proof of origin remains a significant challenge. Possibly it will have been stolen from a museum or other cultural institution or from a private owner. So in criminological terms, these instances would actually be considered theft and are actually easier to generally prosecute in criminal court, as there is often some kind of previous record of their existence. That said, it can be complicated in cases such as the Iraq National Museum in 2003, when during the invasion of Baghdad, the museum suffered both professional and opportunistic thefts, in addition to ransacking and destruction of its records. Back to Brody's definition, illicit antiquities are often sold by reputable vendors without any public indication of ownership history, provenance. In truth, the issue is a bit mixed. Illicit antiquities are sometimes sold without a provenance, but sometimes these are also forged. It should be mentioned here that there is a black market for stolen indicates the legitimate art market is often referred to as gray due to the high numbers of objects sold with questionable or known illicit sources. Unfortunately, borders of ancient civilizations lack alignment with current countries, an argument often used in court to imply countries seeking reparations lack ownership rights. Legal resolutions often involve international parties, also muddying the applicability of various laws. At its most basic, the looting network typically includes the original looters, minimally one middleman, and the ultimate buyer of the piece. With regard to civil cases in the United States, the highest likelihood for symbolic success in creating the most significant monetary impact involves targeting the middlemen to most similarly echo the wins seen in cases against hate groups. In particular, the middlemen have the opportunity to drive the market. Currently, it is not in their best interest to have the mystery and anonymity allowed drive prices up, among other benefits. However, if it is in their best monetary bottom line interest to create transparent practices and refuse to deal in works with shady provenances, then they have the power to create and facilitate change. As a note, this is also the easiest way to influence the behavior of private collectors, as targeting wealthy individuals for such civil cases will not have the same potential symbolic breadth of impact on collecting practices, and the personal resources of such individuals makes winning cases a lot more difficult. We're currently seeing some collecting practices slowly changing in the museum sector anyway because of public pressure to pursue ethical collecting methods. These institutions have less financial wiggle room, and the closing of a museum altogether could potentially hurt communities. So again, in looking for symbolic and financial impact, targeting those auction houses, galleries, and other market facilitators is most fiscal with symbolic significance. In conclusion, the legal system is not designed to pursue satisfying action in criminal court for either hate crimes or illicit antiquities cases. The civil courts provide an avenue that might prove more fruitful in combating these crimes. Burden of proof is lessened, damages awarded in civil cases create a more significant fiscal impact aimed to actually reduce the targeted behavior. The symbolism of such wins also allows for national and international messages of intolerance for such behavior. Due to limitations of criminal legal solutions in the United States, pursuing a civil legal approach might prove more effective in combating both hate crime and antiquities trafficking.
Thank you so much, Kate. Our final presenter is Sophia Sarantakos, and we will turn it over to Sophia.
Morning, everyone. Happy to be here at CrimCon. My name is Dr. Sophia Sarantakos, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Denver Graduate School of Social Work. Today, I'll be talking about some of my work that explores the decision-making processes of prosecutors in deferred prosecution programs. So the guiding research question for the paper I'm presenting today is, what is the thinking that undergirds the lenient decisions made by prosecutors working in deferred prosecution programs? And how might understanding this approach be used to transform general prosecutorial guidelines? So deferred prosecution programs are prosecution-led diversion programs. They're typically reserved for defendants with nonviolent charges. The defendant signs a contract to partake in the program. The prosecutor then holds off on prosecution while the defendant works said program. And then if the requirements are met at the end, the defendant's case is dropped. But if the defendant fails to meet the requirements, then the prosecutors move to prosecute the case. So in a lot of ways, DPPs are actually quite similar to other diversion programs that we see in the criminal legal system, but there are some unique differences to DPPs. The first is that it's front-end diversion as opposed to kind of post-adjudication, right? So if you think about sentencing treatment courts and the like that happen in post-adjudication, because DPPs are actually led by the prosecutor's office, they happen on the front end. And also because they're led by the prosecutor, they can actually create, have the programs either be pre-charge or post-charge, or pre-plea versus post-plea. And essentially what that means is there can either be a charge that's officially put on the record or not. And then either the defendant has to plead guilty to engage in the program or not. Some other differences are that successful completion results in a dismissal of the criminal case, which is not always the case in other diversion programs. And then people who successfully complete can typically also get their cases expunged, which is somewhat different. So to answer my questions, I observed and interviewed prosecutors from 2 large Midwestern district attorney's offices in 2 different states. I observed a total of 409 individual cases and interviewed all DPP prosecutors from each site. I also dug into different extant documentation, and I interviewed prosecutors from each site that were not affiliated with the DPP as well. So through my observations, I learned that the nature of and the impetus for the lenient decisions were actually really, really different across both sites. So Program A's prosecutors made 4 lenient decisions, and they were made when defendants were following the rules set out in the contract. Everything was going swimmingly, everybody was doing as they were told, and the prosecutors in this program described their lenient decisions as rewards. In Program B, however, prosecutors made lenient decisions when defendants were actively breaking contract rules and struggling in the program. And so they made also over twice as many lenient decisions as Program A prosecutors. They made 10 total lenient decisions that I observed over the course of a year. And it's an important thing to note here that I didn't actually observe any differences in their lenient decision-making across sites in terms of race, but obviously much more work needs to be done to actually explore that question, but I did not see it in my field explorations. So after interviewing prosecutors from both sites, I attributed the lenient decision-making processes of Program B's prosecutors to them having a more developed moral imagination, which folks like Mark Johnson, Amy Levad discuss as having the ability to expand your worldview and understand the experiences and positionalities of different people. And so I attribute this, these types of lenient decision-making processes to having a moral imagination. But also through my interviews, I learned that their moral imagination is anchored by 3 particular things. The first is that Program B prosecutors are able to recognize the importance of understanding the context of a criminal charge. They also actively question the legitimacy and/or efficacy of the criminal legal system, and they consider the long-term impacts of their decisions. So I'll now take you through just some examples from the interviews with Program B prosecutors. And so for the first anchor, recognizing the importance of understanding the context of a criminal charge, one Program B prosecutor said, I look at the defendant and their background a little more closely and to their prior record, right? So you have this robbery, but what happened? Why they've been doing things. And this is not typical prosecutorial behavior on the front end, trying to understand the context, particularly in a charge that has a victim and could be obviously seen as a crime of violence, would typically be something that would be exclusionary, that would push them out of the program. For Anchor 2, questioning the legitimacy and or efficacy of the criminal legal system, a program prosecutor said, we want less repeat defendants. And since traditional prosecution and traditional criminal justice doesn't seem to be necessarily reaping those types of rewards, why shouldn't we try to do something different, right? So I think this is pretty self-explanatory. They understand that the way the system has been running for decades is not actually reaping the benefits that they want and the public safety that they hope to achieve. And for the third anchor, considering the long-term impacts, another prosecutor said, so I charged somebody with an offense and that goes on the database and that's public immediately. Even if I dismiss the case, it's on the database for 2 years. And that's really getting to the collateral consequences part, right? I need to look at a case and determine, once I'm past the can I prove it, does this person need to be charged? And this is just a fascinating quote to me because they're saying they're not only understanding all of the collateral consequences that unfold with the charge, but even just questioning, do I need to pull this criminal legal lever to achieve some sort of public safety outcome in the first place, right? Does this person even need to be charged? Do I need to even enact this lever? And so the implications for this or that, it can lead to excarcerative and decarcerative decisions, which I think are really powerful and important. But I also think it can entrench the idea that prosecutors should be the actors addressing the complex needs of defendants. And I come to this work as a prison industrial complex abolitionist and wanting to reduce the size, scope, and power of the PIC and ultimately eliminate prosecutors. So the idea that they think that they need to be addressing substance use, all kinds of complex social needs through the criminal legal system, I think is really problematic. But I also see the worth of them understanding, making individualized decisions, and that leading to understanding justice as equity, and perhaps leading to new ways of addressing harm and actually pulling resources and away from the criminal legal system and actually putting them into community-based efforts. So I do think that there are some really important things we can learn from these efforts, but I also think that it can be dangerous, and so we have to be cautious. So thank you. It was a very quick and dirty presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia. We have about 15 minutes if our panelists would like to chat, and also if any of our audience members have any questions that they would like to pose to our presenters. I think everyone's kind of on the Friday. Give everybody a second to see if anybody has anything that they would like to add in the chat. Thank you guys all for very interesting and unique presentations. I know I definitely learned something new, and definitely areas I hadn't considered before. Does not seem that we're going to get any questions right now. So we will wrap a little bit early, but thank you all for attending this panel on courts. And if you'd like to follow up with any of the presenters, their information I believe should be in the program, but if not, this session will be available on replay. And I know that they all had their contact information at the end of the slides. Thank you all so much. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Bye, guys.
Bye.